Firstly, we learned that every person in the world has a conscience that informs them of the moral law. However, the Bible makes it clear that when we consistently disobey God by ignoring that conscience and choosing to go our own selfish way instead, our conscience becomes seared. This means it becomes calloused, hardened, or insensitive. The Bible frequently refers to people hardening their hearts against God, and that's what it means. Some translations of the Bible even refer to the death of the conscience. It becomes either severely desensitized or completely incapable of discerning right and wrong. And the more that happens, the less power it has to restrain people from do what you want living, and the more likely people are to become cruel, selfish, and capable of extreme acts of violence and wickedness. When we reject God and choose our own path, that is our natural inner trajectory. We become desensitized to evil and accept it as normal. Our hearts become harder. Remember what we learned before. When a man is getting better, he understands more and more clearly the evil that is still left in him. But when a man is getting worse, he understands his own badness less and less. Be honest with yourself. Is there something you freely do now which your conscience once bothered you about? Something where the first time you had the opportunity to do it, you hesitated. You knew it wasn't right. You wrestled with it. But then you forged ahead and did it anyway. And then you kind of got into the habit of doing it. And as you got into the habit of it, the inner voice of opposition weakened. And now you don't hear the voice at all anymore. You hardly think twice these days, and it seems kind of normal and acceptable. Drugs, porn addiction, sleeping with your boyfriend outside of marriage, certain movies you watch, music you listen to with blasphemous lyrics. Have you desensitized yourself to your conscience and convinced yourself that what you're doing is fine? Have you created loopholes for yourself and bent the moral law to suit yourself? As people harden their hearts to their conscience so that they can pursue selfish living, the cumulative effect of the desensitization is a cold and loveless society. People are now capable of shocking deeds. Children are growing up in a culture where they constantly absorb all kinds of evil through video games, television, internet, music, magazines, etc. They're exposed to violence, perversion, sexual sin, and wickedness from a much earlier age, and it's rotting their souls and hardening their hearts. What was once shocking and morally repulsive is now considered the norm. I remember when a lesbian kiss was first screened on British television, and it created a national outcry. Now it happens all the time without raising an eyebrow. Pop culture feeds a steady stream of garbage into our souls, and constantly looks to plumb new depths so as to be more shocking and more explicit. Moral entropy comes by small degrees, and our conscience becomes numbed with each step. I also think the music industry is a great example of this. When Elvis came onto the scene in the 1950s, people were shocked by him. Now we look at Elvis and can't imagine how anyone so harmless could have been so controversial. But this is because Elvis opened the door for the Beatles, who opened the door for Led Zeppelin, who opened the door for Black Sabbath, who opened the door for Marilyn Manson, Eminem, and Cradle of Filth, etc. And now from this place of darkness, Elvis looks like a saint by comparison, just as a 4 a.m. sky looks bright to those living in midnight darkness. What happened is that our parents rebelled against their parents' standards and set a new low. Our generation then rebelled against our parents to go lower still. Our kids will then take our standards and lower them further. Society keeps getting darker by small degrees. On November 3, 2011, a survey by the children's charity Bernardo's discovered that almost half of adult Britons already thought that children in Great Britain were feral and starting to behave like animals. We can see it happening. External evidence of internal corruption. This is simply what happens when God is rejected and moral entropy takes effect. The inner moral compass is lost, and people start to do what they please instead, which is Satanism. And this is just the next generation. What will their kids or grandkids look like unless the entropy is brought to a halt? Finally, remember that the conscience is contained within the spirit, which is the part of the human that can be demonized. So when people get involved in heavy occultism, their consciences can be interfered with, and instead of the voice of God, people can hear the voice of evil instead. Unfortunately, occultism is on the rise in our culture through things like Eastern religion, astrology, yoga, Reiki, and necromancy. Do you think people are becoming more callous, less warm, less forthcoming? Are our towns and city streets less safe for our kids than when we were young? Do you look back a decade or two with nostalgia because those days seemed more innocent somehow? This is what happens to society without its moral reference point. Secondly, we saw that people are informed about the truth of God through creation, but again, people can deliberately choose to harden themselves to the truth about God from what they see in creation. Paul explains what happens as a result. But God shows his anger from heaven against all sinful, wicked people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. Yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks, and they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools, and instead of worshipping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshipped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. So God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desired. As a result, they did vile and degrading things with each other's bodies. They traded the truth about God for a lie. So they worshipped and served the things God created instead of the Creator himself, who is worthy of eternal praise. Amen. That is why God abandoned them to their shameful desires. Even the women turned against the natural way to have sex and instead indulged in sex with each other. And the men, instead of having normal sexual relations with women, burned with lust for each other. Men did shameful things with other men, and as a result of this sin, they suffered within themselves the penalty they deserved. Since they thought it foolish to acknowledge God, he abandoned them to their foolish thinking and let them do things that should never be done. Their lives became full of every kind of wickedness, sin, greed, hate, envy, murder, quarreling, deception, malicious behavior, and gossip. They are backstabbers, haters of God, insolent, proud, and boastful. They invent new ways of sinning, and they disobey their parents. They refuse to understand, break their promises, are heartless, and have no mercy. They know God's justice requires that those who do these things deserve to die, yet they do them anyway. Worse yet, they encourage others to do them too. Notice how Paul focuses on sexual perversion here. One of the basic moral truths that God tells us through creation is that men and women were created for one another. Just by observing creation alone, this should be blatantly obvious. I don't want to get too crude, but if we had no knowledge of God at all and simply saw a naked man and woman next to one another, or had even a basic understanding of biology, we would logically deduce that these two different types of being were meant for one another. Procreation is only possible between men and women. And not only are they clearly physically compatible, but further observation would show them to be mentally and emotionally compatible too. Their natural attributes and desires are complementary. You would pick all this up just by an honest appraisal of creation itself. Therefore, it is deliberate suppression of the obvious truth to go against this natural order and to insist that homosexuality is natural or normal too. When we willfully suppress the truth like this, our minds become dark and confused. We begin indulging in selfish, sinful behavior, and our morality goes into chaos. We get into Satan's do what you want philosophy. That's the kind of thing Paul is getting at in this passage. And we are indeed seeing all the things described on the rise in our culture because we are ignoring the clear revelation of the moral law that God has given us through his creation. In fact, people even suppress the truth that he is the creator at all now. They acknowledge that a painting needs a painter, they acknowledge that a building needs a builder, but bafflingly they refuse to admit that a creation needs a creator. Instead, they prefer to put faith in idols or scientifically disproved theories about evolution. In the previous chapter, I also mentioned that creation forces our cooperation because we suffer if we go against our design. Yet the truth is, over time, our willpower and self-restraint can become so broken down, our hearts can become so polluted, and our selfish desires can become so strong that we're willing to suffer any amount of pain, even to the point of self-destruction, rather than give up our vice. People smoke knowing it's going to kill them, but they can't stop. People drink alcohol to excess, knowing it's going to give them hangovers, but they do it anyway. They know the risks of liver disease, yet they can't resist. They eat and can't stop despite the health problems. They know that they'll regret the sexual encounter in the morning and understand it can lead to disease and accidental pregnancies, yet the lust for selfish satisfaction begins to override all restraints. Do what you want leads to our own destruction because we go against creation's natural design. Thirdly, we saw that civilizations base their civil laws on the moral law for social cohesion, but we also learned that what's legal and what's morally right isn't always the same thing, and when God is marginalized from society and the moral reference point is lost, we tend to find a divergence between the moral law and the civil law. As our minds become darker and morally confused, our lawmakers lose sight of what good and evil is and change laws to permit depravity. So, for example, where Christianity's influence once led to the outlawing of abortion, that has now been reversed and is legal again in many countries. Homosexuality was once illegal, but is now legalized. In fact, at the present time, there is even a push for homosexual marriage to be legalized. We've also recently seen pushes for the legalization of euthanasia. Respect for widows and the elderly is evaporating. Many so-called experts have also been calling for the legalization of soft drugs. On March the 3rd, 2012, two medical ethicists even called for the re-legalization of infanticide. That call caused revulsion amongst the public at the time, but in 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 15, the moral entropy is going to bring the world to a position where infanticide will not only be accepted, but it will be normal. I say that prophetically, but not by any special revelation. I know it simply by observing and learning from history. Without God, we decay. All the evils that were once vanquished by the spread of Christianity are now starting to creep back in. And claiming to be enlightened, people have instead become foolish and confused, and civil laws have begun to reflect that. John de Armand said, "You know your country is dying when you have to make a distinction between what is moral and ethical and what is legal." We have, unfortunately, already arrived at the place where we need to make that distinction.